Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the LSE South Asia Center. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm the Deputy Director here at the South Asia Center. We today have the second event of the Lent term, and I'm very happy to say that we are beginning with an event that's focused on India, the very recently concluded CoP26 climate summit in Glasgow that ended in the middle of November, and where India and the delegation of India led by the Minister of Environment made a very, very dramatic intervention towards the end before the final pact was going to be announced to suggest that a particular wording and a very crucial wording should be amended so that the wording would read that the use of coal would be phased down by 2070 as opposed to being phased out. I will speak a bit more about this shortly, but before that, please could I give a very warm welcome to our speakers, whom I will introduce just now, and also a very warm welcome to our audience who have joined us from across the globe, literally across various time zones. This is one of the very few good things that has come out of the pandemic, that we are able to do these kinds of events, and we are not limited to having on-site events. And over the last 2 years, even the most critical of Luddites have adapted to things like Zoom, so we are now able to have this kind of a panel. And I should say to the audience that some of our panelists are actually speaking from very, very radically different time zones. The audience should know that this event is actually being conducted via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube. An unedited recording of this event will be available from tomorrow on our website in the archive section of the events for those of you who may want to go back and listen to it again, or those who may have missed it today. The chat function is enabled on the YouTube, as you can see, and I very much encourage members of the audience to pose questions as you listen or once you have listened. If you would like to pose a question to a particular speaker, then please do mention them by name. If you would like to pose a question to the entire panel, you're very, very welcome to do so, and I will pose the question to them on your behalf. If you are the kinds who tweet, then please do tweet and tag us. If you would like to tag individual speakers, their individual Twitter handles are actually given in the details on the YouTube page where you're viewing this at the moment. If you look at the details, all their Twitter handles are given over there, and you're very welcome to tag them as well. I should add here that had this event been on site, audience members at the LSE, when they attend events on site, have the right to not reveal their identity when they ask a question to any panelist. There is no obligation for a member of the audience to say who they are while asking a question. Now, in trying to keep us close to that spirit, when I ask questions on your behalf to the panelists, I will not be announcing your names, even though I know that your names are visible on the YouTube channel. But at least we will try to remain somewhat in step with the spirit of the right that audiences have when they attend events on site. Before I go on to introduce the speakers, I just wanted to say a few words about why and how this event came about, why we decided to do this event, and what we think, we as in the center thinks is crucial about this very, very important topic. As I said at the beginning, towards the end of the COP26 summit in Glasgow, India made a very, very interesting and dramatic intervention to ask for an amendment in the language so that the sentence that read that coal would be phased out by 2070 would now read as coal would be phased down. It was so last minute that in fact this amendment could not be circulated to all the member countries who were attending. I think there were 197 countries who attended the Glasgow summit, and it could not be, and it was incorporated. I should add here that China was also party to this amendment, but India did make so, led by the Minister for Environment, Mr. Bhupendra Yadav. It was dramatic in the very literal sense of the word, followed by an equally dramatic emotional statement by the current president from the UK government, Alok Sharma, as a lot of you would have seen at that time. It was dramatic also because, for those of you who may not know, these climate pacts, actually the language of it needs to be agreed by each and every participating country, 197 of them. The reason being that it is then believed that each will then go away and pursue the goals as have been laid out in the pact. But in this instance, it was not possible to run it past everyone. The reason why this change literally of one word is so important is because over the last few years, but especially in COP26, fossil fuels, and coal in particular, has been identified as one of the most important drivers in the rise of global temperatures and global warming. So much so that you would all know that Britain has, in fact, UK has in fact taken over the presidency practically only 2 or 3 days ago. I think it was the 24th of January that they took on the presidency. And the day they took on the presidency of COP26, number 10 Downing Street, which is the official residence and office of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, tweeted. And in that tweet, I'm actually going to read out the entire tweet to you. It's a very short tweet, but the last sentence is crucial to what we are discussing today. The Glasgow Climate Pact set a clear roadmap to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees and the beginning of the end for coal power. This is, I've just summarized the tweet, but that last bit is literal. And it draws attention to both the importance and the centrality of coal in this whole debate, and therefore also draws attention to the importance of India's intervention and request to amend the language. Why is this so important? Why did India ask for this change in wording when at the same time, India has also made several very bold promises, promises that it promises to fulfill, to reach net zero targets in a staggered way at different times, but definitely with 2070 in mind. And here I do also want, and India has made some very, very serious commitments towards reaching net zero targets that I know that Vaibhav is going to speak about. But it's important because a lot of things that India has said actually shows India's commitment to addressing the whole question of climate change and climate emergency, as we have learned to call it in more recent years. Coal is, of course, a massive, massive industry in India. It employs a huge number of people, skilled and semi-skilled labor force. It is related to infrastructure, to the energy sector, but also at a far more prosaic level to livelihoods, to survival. The use of coal in the cooking of food, even today, remains real in India. So there are several sectors in the economy that are still dependent on the use of coal, and coal has a place at various levels. For both the common people, for the state, and so on and so forth. And Rahul is going to, Rahul has an entire edited volume on this I'll mention the volume as we go ahead. There is therefore a very, very important economic human underbelly to the use of coal and the functioning of coal and the coal sector. I'm purposely choosing not to use the word coal industry here because industry in itself has an economic, sort of connotation to it. And those of you who are on social media and are familiar with it would surely have seen this now viral video clip by Vijay Prashad at the COP26 summit, where he made this very, very Marxist, eloquent speech about how it is very difficult to ask for targets for 2070 when people today are struggling to get food and water in various parts of the world. and bringing about these kinds of changes are not only nowhere near their priority, but is in fact almost a luxury for them to think about when they're literally struggling for food and for water, and when and what and how these things can be addressed right now. Okay, they cannot. As he said, cannot even think about 2070. Now, you don't have to be that forceful and dramatic to make this very, very human and humane point about survival and to draw attention to the essentiality of having viable, affordable, alternative arrangements for the poor and the less privileged in the world. Having said all that, and each of this, all of us believe to be rightful, there are other realities too. The temperature of the world is rising, it is going up, it is getting warmer. Even though COP26 is committed to limiting it to 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times, that is. Fossil fuels do contribute, coal does contribute to global warming. There is an impact on public health. I'm delighted that Shweta is here. And most importantly, probably most importantly, looking at the future, we don't have another planet to go to if we run out of being able to live over here. So it is a very important debate. There are other equally important factors in this. India contributes between 5 and 7%. It's India's carbon footprint, whereas it houses almost 17% of the world's population. To put it in perspective, the United States houses only 4% of the world's population, but contributes 14% to global warming. Now, in every which way, when we take a balanced look at this, India's response or request for the amendment seems very realistic. But also realistically, it would seem that this is not the steps that have been announced and the steps that are meant to be taken. It is not about a single government. It is not about a group of people or even a set of interest groups. If you're looking at 2070, we're looking at decades ahead. So how policy needs to be brought forth and established, and a certain thinking brought into the working of all these as the country moves towards that destination is equally important, and policy will play a very, very important role. And Navroz, who's here, has very has written on it and a number of things. I should say here that the CPR actually put out last April, I think Navroz is going to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was last April that they put out a 10-point thing about various sorts of things that could be done. I was reading it a few days ago. Anyway, it is now my very pleasant task to introduce the speakers. The order in which I introduce the speakers is the order in which they will speak. We've agreed on an order ahead of this event. Each speaker has been invited to make initial remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes. And after that, we'll have a moderated discussion. Once again, members of the audience, you're very, very welcome to ask questions. I will pose the questions on your behalf. And once again, if you would like to ask a question to a particular speaker, please do mention their name. Otherwise, you're welcome to pose the question to the entire panel. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, who will speak first, is fellow at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW, in New Delhi, and has been part of various committees and groups of the Government of India concerning India's energy and climate policy. Dr. Rahul Tongia is Senior Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress and one of the editors of the very relevant volume titled Future of Coal in India, Smooth Transition or Bumpy Road Ahead, which was published in 2021 last year. Shweta Narayan is a climate and health campaigner at Healthcare Without Harm, HCWH, and is based in India. Dr. Swati Dhingra is an economist and associate professor in economics here at the LSC. Swati is also a member of the faculty advisory group of the LSC South Asia Center. Navroz Dubash is professor at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi and publishes on climate change, energy, air pollution, water policy, and the politics of regulation in the developing world. So without further ado, I'm now going to invite Vaibhav to speak. You have about 6 to 8 minutes. Vaibhav, you need to switch your microphone on.
Sorry about that. Hi, Nilanjan, and thank you, LSE, for inviting me. Very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the colleagues, my fellow panelists. Let me jump in straight about about the discussion today. So COP is obviously about many different aspects, and one could talk a lot about many different issues, and I believe my panelists will talk about many different aspects. I'll probably focus on the net zero in 2070 target. So that's what CW's worked heavily on that part of the debate in India. Net zero in 2070. First of all, net zero is based on many different aspects, and the choice that the government of India proposed, it is ambitious, yet it is realistic. So that's the first point I want to emphasize. And in fact, this whole point about coal phase down versus phase out, that took a lot of attention at the end of the COP. The larger question is it really at odds with the net zero target that has been proposed by the government of India? I don't think that is the case, but just sort of highlighting that because that's also a issue high in the debate. So in terms of the net zero itself, there are many different aspects of the net zero debate. I'll highlight 5 of them because I think these 5 are very most important probably. The first is about responsibility. And the question, all of us have heard a lot about the historical responsibility question, but the question here is also about future responsibility. And as already said by the highest authorities of India also, that the right to develop does not mean the right to pollute. And that is something very important. This simply means that India before this particular announcement had a bunch of choices. It could have gone for maybe 2080, 2090 also, given the state of development. But this whole question about future responsibility and this recognition that climate change is happening, it's an emergency. So to the extent possible, one has to limit, this carbon impact or climate impact to the future of one's own emissions. That is about responsibility, future as well as historical responsibility. The second aspect is about feasibility. The feasibility is extremely important because in terms we're talking about the systemic transition. And if let's say there are many discussions around a 2050 net zero target for India, many other countries in the developed world have talked about or announced a 2050 target. The question always is for an economy like India, which is still growing fast, how feasible is it to achieve a net zero in 2050 versus a later date, right? So this notion of feasibility, the notion of system transition, how fast can one achieve a deep decarbonization future across different sectors, that issue becomes very important. It's a practical issue. The third aspect is about economic costs. Economic costs are real, and in fact, in the many different aspects, it's not just about the macroeconomic cost that we keep on focusing many times. It's also about the distributional consequences, which are extremely important. This whole debate about just transition, which is about not just the coal miners, but also the household, low income and vulnerable households who could potentially be impacted if there is a faster transition towards, let's say, an earlier net zero year. Those economic costs really matter a lot. So one needs to understand those economic costs. Then the fourth aspect is the issue of differentiation. Now, as a principle, differentiation has been a very important principle since the beginning of the UNFCCC negotiations. Here now we are talking about differentiation in a very different formulation. In the sense, many countries have already announced, let's say, 2050 net zero target. What India has been saying is that, well, it is 2070 for India, but the developed world should actually start, try to achieve net zero by maybe 2030, 2035, and aim at net negative by 2050 because of their historical responsibility as well as capabilities. But there has to be some element of differentiation in the debate, which is very critical. Then the final aspect of this net zero debate is about opportunity. The writing on the wall is very clear. So energy markets around the world are changing very fast. And the dependence on fossils, it is going to go down. That is also very clear. But this very significant shift throws up many opportunities for the future. The question is, which country and which actors will move fast and start grabbing this opportunity. So these are, many different aspects. And when in CW's work, we started proposing 2070 as a potential net zero year that India could propose, it was looking at all of these aspects, which is about looking at India's future climate impacts, about the feasibility of sectoral transition, the economic cost that different communities could be the fiscal implications to the government, the whole idea of differentiation and the opportunity it brings. Looking at all of these aspects is when we started thinking about 2070 appeared to be something which is, as I said, ambitious, is still achievable. Now, having said that, uh, many of the experts, I think many of my colleagues also say that 2070 is too far. I think anybody who interacts a lot with the industry, and as an institution, for CW, it's very important to learn from the decision makers in the industry, because they are the people who are taking these decisions and putting money on the table. Any industrial investment or any investment in the power sector, in fact, the gestation period is between 30 to 50 years. And it's very important. So it's not the difference between investing in an industrial plant versus, let's say, buying a car is very, very, very big, because the lifetime of a car might be for 10, 12 years. So I could still buy a car, which is a petrol car, in 2050, and it doesn't matter. I could still achieve net zero by 2070. But for industrial investment, for a coal power investment, the gestation period is 30, 40, 50 years. So 2070 is actually, if you start talking to Indian industry experts, they've started waking up, and they're taking notice of this. So 2070 is actually not too far at all for these very long gestational investments. That's an important point to be made. And now this, for India, as I said, it's a fast-growing economy. So of course, the whole global limelight is on net zero. But for India, it's not just about net zero. It is about, first of all, peaking. As I said, it's a fast-growing economy. Even the peak is too far. Right? So the question is, when would India's emissions peak? And then would they go down slightly? Would they plateau and then go down? All those permutation and combination would be there, which is fine. The point is, it has to peak first in a fast-growing economy, and then it has to go down to and across sectors to achieve the net zero kind of future, which is now the target on the table. So that element, which it simply means we need to understand sectoral strategies. So how different sectors are placed. For example, the power sector might be much better placed because renewable energy, battery, that's where the costs are falling down pretty fast. The passenger transport sector might be much better placed because new models are arriving both in two-wheelers and four-wheelers, which are much more competitive. But there might be some other hard-to-abate sectors that might go later. Now, all of these are like operational mechanics, which one can get into a lot of detail. I won't get into a lot of detail, but the larger point is, well, this is what is operational strategy for a 2070 net zero needs to be formulated. It's already being formulated now. And finally, on this question of this coal phase out, I don't think it's probably, it's only for the negotiation perspective, it is consequential. Otherwise, as the real economy perspective, I don't think it's the most consequential development that has actually happened at COP, even though the limelight it took away after the conclusion of COP was phenomenal. But nowhere on ground, it is actually very consequential in terms of the way the Indian energy sector is moving towards the 2030 targets, which have been put on the table, also the 2070 target. And also, I just want to conclude by saying that every country is expected to submit something called the long-term strategy. The long-term strategy means it will be, it will have some other intermediate targets. Ultimately, it will be a bunch of short-term targets that will guide the whole economy towards this longer-term net zero target. That's how we are expected to move. So let me just conclude here. I'll probably come back to other aspects of the debate after all my fellow panelists have spoken. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Rahul to speak now, but before that, I just wanted to say, for the benefit of those in the audience who are watching, I can see and maybe unaware, but one of the things Rahul mentioned in passing very, very briefly when he was speaking about developed countries and the urge from the developing countries to the developed countries that perhaps they should meet their targets by 2035 and then move forward is also related to the whole question of how long the effects of fossil fuels remain in the atmosphere, because there is a very strong line of debate that actually says that the remnants of even fossil fuel use, particularly in Britain, for instance, where Swati and I are at the moment, from the post-industrial revolution times and the post-industrial revolution times, that impact is still there to be felt high up in the air. So there is a very long-term impact of fossil fuel and coal in particular, which is the thing we keep coming back to. But Dr. Rahul Tongia is Senior Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress and one of the editors of the very relevant volume for today's event, titled Future of Coal in India, Smooth Transition or Bumpy Road Ahead, which was published last year. Rahul, I know you are going to speak about coal and and the focus of this, but do please speak a bit about your volume as well, so both we will know as well as audience members will know what is there in the volume. Thanks.
Thank you, Nilanjan. So, hello, everyone. So the volume actually came out in 2020, not last year, late 2020, not a big deal. And it's an edited volume, but probably 40% was written by me. A lot of in-house primary research was done. So it's not just an edited volume in the typical sense, but there was a lot of primary research looking at every dimension of coal, from the ecosystem, the life cycle, the sort of political economy, the pricing. And of course, with India coal, you cannot ignore who produces it. So Coal India is the world's largest coal miner, and Coal India pays a dividend. And in fact, some would argue that the government enjoys, almost is addicted to the dividend that Coal India pays out. So the pricing is set up in such a way. I'll come back to that. I want to just mainly give three thoughts for the audience. And these are drawing partly from the book, partly post CoP26. And it's really about putting coal in context. So the first sort of thought relates to the fact that I agree with Vaibhav, it's just semantics. Phase down versus phase out is relatively irrelevant from an action plan, but it's actually, you should step back and say, why this focus on coal? Why not on carbon emissions and let countries figure out what they do? UK is down to a couple of % coal. Well, that's because they have a lot of gas, and gas emits a lot of fossil fuel, not as much as coal, but your consumption of gas is far higher. So if you look at the per capita consumption of coal in India. It's from our book. There's a table. It's also on our blog. So publicly, those who don't buy the book, there's a full summary on our website, 5,000 words. The per capita consumption of coal in India is half the world average in 2019. China is half the world's total consumption. India is actually lower. Germany, US are multiple times higher consumption of coal. But what's missing in that discourse is the use of gas, because coal is only 12% or 17% of your primary energy mix, while for India, it's 50%. So when you say phase down coal, well, India needs electricity, it doesn't need heating. So then the question becomes, why are you signaling out something that doesn't add up? So just to give context on the other side, per capita gas consumption in India, 1,000 cubic feet per capita, 2019 again, was about, if I remember my numbers correctly, 1.8 TCF. It was 35 for Germany, 85 for the US, and over 100 for Russia. So even though gas emits a third lower emissions than coal, 40%, I mean, when you blend with the power sector, which is a bigger differentiation, it still doesn't compensate. So this whole spiel about, oh, we need to phase down coal, wind down, wind out. Every country needs to figure out by when they plateau their coal and by when they get rid of it. And this will vary based on what your alternatives are. In India, we're not adding any more coal power plants. There was a huge, huge growth of power plant capacity between 2011 and 2016. Capacity in the power sector grew by 14.5%. Demand only grew by about 6.6 or 6.7%. And so there's an overhang of surplus coal capacity. So now what is India adding? It's only adding renewables. That's all the growth in capacity that's occurring. But the age of power plants does matter. South Africa, the average age is close to 30 years. US is close to 40 years. So it's very easy to talk about a wind down, getting rid of it completely sooner rather than later. Even if we let all these plants live till the end of their economic life, India's cumulative emissions, even prospectively, will not be so high. So I have a paper on flatten the curve, why cumulative emissions matter much more than date of net zero. That really talks about the fact of by when you need to take certain actions, and India still has time. The second aspect I wanted to bring out was, if you say I want to wind down coal or phase out, wind down, whatever, the question becomes, what's your alternative? As Vaibhav mentioned, power sector is relatively easy, and it's 70% of coal consumption in India-ish, plus or minus. And here, even renewables are where India has made commitments, but it's also where industry has latched onto. But on the other hand, for industry, there is very limited cheap gas, and hydrogen, contrary to popular belief, still has a premium in the foreseeable future. And so countries like India should first focus on cleaning up, making as efficient whatever they do. Then they should figure out how to peak, then worry about getting rid of their coal emissions. So I want to just counter one conventional wisdom. Vaibhav mentioned certain capacity, like a steel plant may last 30 to 50 years. Steel plants are relatively unique, but for most other coal usage, because discount rates and costs of capital are higher in India, 30 to 40 years later, your present value is very low, your GDP will have grown. Therefore, even writing off something at the tail end will not be as expensive as people think about. In the renewable space, almost all of the growth planned, and much of it today, is variable RE, no battery. And that's where the competition between coal gets interesting. In the very short run, renewables just displace coal in the day, like solar is much of the growth. So in the middle of the day, it's great. It displaces coal and it meets some of incremental demand. But there is incremental demand in the evenings outside the solar window. And today that is met by coal. Coal is India's backstop. So the most important question that comes up for India when it talks of reducing its coal is how quickly are you going to add renewables, and at what time would price points of storage technologies improve? Contrary to popular belief, batteries are not cheaper than coal. There are these bids that are called round-the-clock bids for renewables. They are not based on storage. They're based on oversizing the RE or hybrids. They are not delivering true evening displacement, which in the short run isn't India's challenge. That'll only become the need 3 to 5 years hence. So that's when India will need to really revisit how has demand grown, how much of coal capacity have we retired, etc. So India will need, as will all developing countries, to rethink how they price electricity. Levelized cost of electricity is a very poor marker for saying that this electricity is cheaper than that electricity, until you add in time of day aspects, system level costs, transmission costs. There's so many things that are missing from the pricing signals. So there is a future, maybe 8, 10, we don't know how many years out, where in the middle of the day, the marginal cost will be zero. When you have surplus solar, you're going to be curtailing it or throwing it away. The last, and we have a GRID 2030 study looking at this in great detail. The last component now deals with the political economy. It is well known, the book goes into excruciating detail, that if you look at the 3 components of coal delivered to power plants, again, focusing on power sector just for a bit, there's mining, there's transport, and then there are levies and taxes. Levies and taxes are close to 800 something. This is again 2017-18 numbers, were about 800 something rupees a ton. The miner, if you got notified price, again, this is the distortions that are out there. Do you actually get cheap coal, or are you left to fend for yourself or to import, which is expensive coal? So private sector is stuck with more imports. Captive power is stuck with more imports. But if you can get notified coal, it's in the order of 1,000 rupees a ton. And then you've got transport, which varies by distance. If you're pithead or mine mouth, you avoid the railways tax. I call it a tax because officially 31% of the railways freight charges on coal are used to pay for passengers who underpay. So this is a very large amount. And literally, coal is keeping the Indian railways afloat. In the last few years, the ton kilometers growth had slowed down because they had done what is called coal rationalization. They had fixed which coal goes to which location. And the other change has happened that the plant load factor or capacity utilization factor of pithead plants has increased a lot, while faraway plants have almost died out. Their load factors are low and they're facing, think about renewables. Coal is in Eastern India, Central India. Where is the renewables? South India and West India. So there is a transport arbitrage and a problem to be played. So how we see this playing out is it's going to be a transition that is sometimes faster than people are ready for. You look at NTPC, it's just like KFC. We are not Kentucky Fried Chicken. Sorry, bad name. It's KFC. So it's not National Thermal Power Corporation. It's NTPC. And they are now going to be one of the largest renewable players in India. Same for CIL. So coal is still the backstop, but the phase down, it's the stabilization of growth rates, which is really the short-term horizon that policymakers need to plan for, and figure out the social welfare redistribution to keep that whole, because you have state taxes, you have railways, you have so many components that depend on this. There needs to be a plan, and it's, as Vaibhav said, it's not just about the miners.
Thank you very much, Rahul. I'm going to invite Shweta, but you've just heard two presentations, initial sets of initial remarks, which say that the stabilization and the planned reduction needs to either go in tandem with or be preceded by different kinds of peaking of the economy and peaking of sectors and so on and so forth. There is generally, on balance in the bigger picture, much less attention paid to public health, and yet we know that not only global warming, but fossil fuels have a very dramatic impact on public health, amongst other things, amongst a variety of other things. But Shweta, we're all looking forward to hearing from you. Shweta Narayan is a climate and health campaigner at Healthcare Without Harm, HCWH, and is based in India. Shweta, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thanks, Nilanjan, and thanks to my co-panelists for giving their perspective. I think I'm gonna split my intervention into 2 parts. One, I want to talk about the environment and health impacts of coal in particular, and our experiences from communities in India. And second part of the intervention would be, of course, commenting on what transpired at COP and what does that mean. Now, from environment and health point of view, coal is dirty from cradle to grave. And that means the mining, processing, transportation, burning, and disposal of coal waste is toxic, wasteful, and harms communities. And in the conversations around coal in general, the externalities never get adequately addressed. Now, it is claimed that coal is cheap and it's a cheap source of electricity, but coal companies have routinely externalized the cost onto the public. And when we aggregate the subsidies, the health costs from air and water pollution, the degradation of ground and surface water, the loss of land, forest, culture and heritage, and on top of it, the cost of global warming, the cost of coal is not a cheap source of electricity. It's quite expensive. And when we talk in the context of climate, we only focus on one aspect of coal, and that is the carbon. What we miss out in normally all our conversations, and which has far-reaching implications, is the toxics part of coal and coal pollution and its impacts on health and environment, and how, I mean, Dr. Nilanjan, you mentioned about like how the emissions from coal stay for very long. I'm talking about toxic emissions from coal like mercury that stays in the environment forever, and it's not localized. The point source could be one, and the point of contact or poisoning for communities and for ecology could be many thousand kilometers away. It's a global, persistent chemical, toxic chemical. So coal is one of the main sources of mercury emission in our environment. Now, from ecological and human impacts of coal, if you see, I mean, there are plenty. There's air pollution, of course, and much has been spoken about India's air pollution crisis. India has 9 out of the 10 most polluted cities in the world, and burning of coal releases sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, lead, arsenic, mercury, and other heavy metals, and also the particulate matter 2.5. And I mean, from a health perspective, chemicals, these toxins in the air, when inhaled, penetrate in the lining of lungs, enter the bloodstream and cause respiratory diseases, brain strokes, cardiovascular diseases. And I mean, we are an example as a country how we face the air pollution crisis throughout the year, and especially during the winter seasons in the Indo-Gangetic Plains. I don't need to speak much about it. It's very well known. The another interesting part in terms of health impacts of coal is that a lot of the distress or disease from coal is assumed to be respiratory illness, but that's not the fact. There are studies that indicate that communities living around coal mines, power plants, or fly ash ponds have shown significant health impacts on almost all organs of their body. And as last year in 2021, there was a study from Indian Council of Medical Research in Raigarh district of Chhattisgarh, which is one of the biggest coal belts, which found increased risk of diseases along with acute respiratory infection, cardiovascular disease, tuberculosis, road traffic accidents, mental illnesses, and skin diseases among the population. And this is the indigenous community that is around this coal belt. There's another study from Jharkhand in Ramgarh district, and the study was interesting because it compared the health conditions of people living around coal mines, 50 meters to 5 kilometer radius, to health conditions of a similar community living at the distance of 40 kilometers from a coal mine. And the differences were stark in terms of health impacts. And according to the study, communities living closer to coal mines have higher spread of health complaints, 6 or more complaints, as opposed to 1 to 3 complaints in a community living away from coal mines. So in terms of evidence of health impacts, it's not respiratory illness alone, it's complete, the entire organs of the body are affected. People who have no history of working in the coal mines, but living in the vicinity of the coal mines or coal power plants or fly ash ponds have shown a far severe health impacts. And unfortunately, none of this gets sort of factored in while we're making a decision about a coal plant or a coal mine or a fly ash pond location. So this is like the human health impact. And then there is the ecological health impact, which also influences the human health. Now, there is widespread contamination of land, agricultural field, and there is crop loss. And there are studies that have been done again in Chhattisgarh, in Jharkhand, in Tamil Nadu, which have shown prevalence of extremely toxic heavy metals in people's homes, in people's water bodies, in their farms, which according to the Indian standards alone, those levels would automatically be, these areas would be declared as hazardous waste sites. And these are people's homes and people's farms. And there is extreme damage of crop loss. There is fishery loss in the rivers and lakes where the coal discharge and the fly ash discharge meets. Again, referring back to the ICMR study of Raigarh, very interestingly, the Raigarh study found very high levels of malnutrition in the community. So from a health perspective and then social health perspective also, the places which have the biggest mines and the biggest power plants are also the most least developed places and have very high levels of social inequities and other challenges. Another aspect I think is very crucial, and especially in context of India, is the water usage and water pollution, which again is not much talked about. Now, contamination and depletion of surface and groundwater sources is the most common story you will hear in any coal-powered or coal mine community. I mean, this is just rampant. I mean, it's prevalent, and coal power is most water intensive. I mean, Indian power plants with cooling towers consume twice as much water than the global counterparts, and 48% of coal power plants in India exist in water scarce districts, and this has huge implications. I mean, we're talking about if we are talking about continued use of coal, we are not just talking about that product itself, but we are talking about an implication which is far wider to communities, and especially in the context of climate emergencies. If we talk about the persistent drought, the water scarcity would lead to severe health problems and diseases. The last bit that I want to talk about, again, which is super important, is the coal fly ash, the problem of coal fly ash. Again, in the context of coal, very little is spoken about the problem of coal fly ash. Now, Indian coal-fired thermal power plants generate on an average 200 million metric tons of ash annually, and this has been steadily increasing. In terms of land use, this conventional disposal of ash in form of slurry currently occupies nearly 40,000 hectares of land and requires 1,040 million metric cubic meter of water annually. From again, I mean, in terms of the spread, and fly ash is toxic again. I mean, it contains severe heavy metals which are persistent in the environment for years. They get into our water bodies, they get into our land, they get into our air, and they have the potency to poison us for years to come.
Sure.
The last two bits that I want to focus on is the issue of environmental injustice. And most of the coal burning and coal mining happens in areas and communities that are socially and economically marginalized. So there is a sort of a justice aspect to the entire debate of coal, which again is not talked about. I mean, these are areas which have been conveniently declared as or assumed as sacrifice zones in our country. Now, coming to the COP summit and the conversations that happened around, especially around the coal phase down or phase out, I think from a point of view, especially looking at the Indian scenario and working with communities over here, the fact that India even committed to a conversation of phase down or out doesn't matter, but this was the first beginning of a conversation of saying that there is an end to coal, or there's a possible end to coal at some point. So from that point of view, it was quite reassuring. I agree with my co-panelists, it's a matter of semantics, because while India was being targeted, I think from an equity point of view, India was somewhat unfairly targeted for its commitments. While when we are talking about fossil fuel, nobody talked about oil and gas as much as, and the Indian minister also highlighted that. Why only coal? It's coal, oil and gas, and we need to talk about that. There was not much conversation that happened about the finance, which is critical in supporting developing nations to move away from fossil fuel, and there was not much attention about it. So from an equity point of view, I think India was unfairly targeted, but at the same time, the same equities exist within India between the coal producing areas and the communities over there facing the onslaught of environmental contamination and health impacts, and other places. And India has to address those domestic inequities when it comes to coal use. And in our argument, when we say that we are not yet ready to give up coal, or it's going to take time, then I think my final intervention is that it's important to assess coal from the lens of the externalities, and especially the lens of health, because the cost that the communities are paying and people are paying is absolutely important in understanding where the future lies actually. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Shweta. I'm sorry to have rushed you slightly, but we are sort of tight on time. Before I invite Swati to speak, I did want to make this point about that you said about finance and about equity, just to say that the final pact actually includes in its second section, I think it is number 6, which says, I'm reading from a draft, a near final draft, which says it emphasizes the urgency of scaling up action and support, including finance, capacity building and technology transfer to enhance adaptive capacity, and then goes on to say that it's for developing countries, etc. But nonetheless, it's a very important point, and a point to be noted by all the developed countries in relation to those who are being asked to suddenly change the use of coal. But you have also drawn attention to the other very important thing, which is that not only the inequity within India, but also the long-term and diverse and varied impact that the continuing use of coal has on public health in different and various ways. Lingering impact as well, I should say, because you mentioned mercury, which is something that was on my mind as well. Dr. Swati Dhingra is an economist and associate professor in the Department of Economics here at LSE. Swati is also a member of the faculty advisory group of the LSE South Asia Center. Swati, please speak now.
Great, thank you so much for having me. So let me start with saying I'm feeling so pleased that I went after Shweta, so I don't have to make the same sort of argument with, not quite that level of finesse that Shweta just demonstrated. Let me actually start with saying that we can keep calling, it'll always be in any international negotiation, and a lot of my work is on trade agreements. So I know this fairly well, that there'll always be some, kettle calling the pot black, vice versa. There's also going to be always issues about how to fit in the challenges that the developing world is going to undertake as opposed to the developed world. And I think those are points that have already been brought forward a lot, so I won't talk about them in great detail. And instead, what I'm going to try and point out is much more in the direction of what Shweta just mentioned, which is that India actually has a reason, and a very good economic reason, to want to try and curb emissions on its own for the huge health and environmental impacts that it has in India. So Shweta mentioned a little bit ago about how, depending on where you're trying to cut the list, 21 out of the 30 most polluted cities in the world are in India. Or if you want to go with some other list, then, so maybe say 10 out of the 20 are in India. So in that sense, it's already taking a huge toll in terms of public health, in terms of environment, and even more importantly, as we're seeing in Delhi, in terms of what it's doing to day-to-day life of people. So in that sense, there's a real sort of imperative here to be able to think about where India is going to be in terms of the actual environment that people are facing in the country. So then let me get to saying, well, I think we should be encouraged, as the other panelists were encouraged, by what has happened in terms of the energy sector, that coal is no longer necessarily the cheapest alternative that you have for, say, production of electricity. And in that sense, I'm going to refer to work that E. Somanathan's done for many, many years, and I've learned a lot from a lot of his work that he's published. So just to give you a sense of what those numbers tell you, and this is not the only study that gives numbers like these. You can read a whole various amounts from policy think tanks, from academics, etc. Broadly, the conclusions are the same, which is to say that if you don't account for the health or the environmental externalities, and you only look at purely what the operating costs of power plants are, coal is still going to be unviable for a large number of the plants that exist in India. Renewables do offer better alternatives in some sense in terms of the operating costs. There's the issue, of course, of the reliability of those renewables in terms of how much they can deliver during peak hours when the resource isn't available. If you account for the externalities, which Shweta mentioned, of course, health being one of the primary ones of those, you start counting in the mortality costs that it has, the loss of agricultural yields because of the contamination of land, etc., etc. You start putting those into account. About half the coal plants are really not looking particularly socially viable then. So in that sense, I'm encouraged that these really sort of pork barrel issues about whether coal is sustainable or not, economically is actually going to be a very, very important factor in driving change in India. And that's something which we're seeing in many of these commitments that are being reflected. So I think those are sort of good, policies in some sense, because they also happen to be economically very much aligned with what we're seeing happen in energy markets. But of course, there's the much broader issue, which has been hinted very often, and particularly sort of Shweta was very vocal about what that means for what is happening to people who live in these communities. And we've got to sort of acknowledge the fact that there have to be provisions for just transitions, given that where the coal belt is in India happens to be Orissa, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, places which we know are not going to be sort of the ones that are relatively unharmed by what we've seen happen post the pandemic with the economic impacts and what have been structural issues which have kept these states behind. So I think putting those two things in perspective, what we need is much more serious government action, which comes from the highest echelons, from the central government, which is going to be, of course, a key player when it comes to anything about energy prices in India. And since that's sort of, at the end of the day, as Rahul put it, there is, of course, the price signal, which is wrong because it's never accounting for these sorts of externalities. So in that sense, getting the central government involved to really set the agenda forward is critical. But of course, none of that can come as we all, all of us being from some part of India somewhere, having seen the difference in terms of what, say, a Supreme Court judgment might say and what the grassroots action on that might be. That at the end of the day, that accountability has to come from local governments as well. And, states can do their bit. And we've seen some action in terms of green grids. We've seen also some action from the central government, but that level of accountability has to come from local governments. So I'm going to say one thing about that, which is that the just transition problem is not trivial. There's a huge amount of, across state allocations, across district allocations. And the numbers out there do reflect a fair amount of uncertainty. So if you go with the sort of direct plus indirect that Coal India Limited is going to tell you, you'll probably come up with a number like 1 million. You start taking into account the other more indirect factors, where of course our level of knowledge of really being able to pinpoint those particular impacts is much less. The number would go up to something like 21.5 million in a population where the labor force participation is about 400-500 500 million people. So these aren't trivial costs. If you start looking at the upper limits of them, it's 5% of the working population, which if you start putting it in perspective, what the impacts of COVID have already been in India and where India started from post demonetization, post the GST sort of slowdown, we're really talking about very, very significant adjustments, possibly over a fairly short period of time if they're done in a very disorderly way. If they happen to be sort of, we start thinking about these issues now, we're probably going to be able to, at least to some degree, get them to be an orderly collapse. And that's, Nilanjan mentioned about the collieries in the UK. It just so happens that my colleague, who's the director of my center, happened to have worked a lot on the collieries in the UK. And what we know from there already is that the economic factors were important. Many of the collieries that shut down even during the Margaret Thatcher era were really ones that were already showing that they were unproductive, or there were ones, of course, where the unions had gained power, had actually invested to make those mines much more productive. And then there was sort of the issue that followed afterwards about the economic decline that happened in these areas, which we're still seeing the consequences of. So these are going to be really, really important issues which need to get the attention that they aren't quite getting yet. And at the end of the day, I'm going to stop with saying something that the reason I was encouraged when Nilanjan invited me, and also very, very trepid about what I could feel like I could say comfortably and not say, was because I would say I'm relatively new to the field. And what I have learned, we have a waste management project going on in Bihar, trying to reduce how much waste goes into landfill or ends up completely untreated and probably even burned. What I've learned from people there was, contrary to what I was saying, that we need to hold the local government accountable, they wanted to turn around and tell me, well, what are you doing? And in that sense, the local community is going to be a really fundamental key component of what happens. And we've seen it in Delhi already. Yes, you can have Supreme Court saying that you need to pay damages for having polluted air. But at the end of the day, till the clamor comes from the residents, it's hard to see how real change will actually happen in a fairly short period of time. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swati, and I'm sure we'll come back to this. And before I invite Navroz, just a couple of things. One is I'd like to remind the members of the audience once again that they're very welcome to ask questions, but also to Shweta, you, and to Swati, you. There is in this, and I've been reading a lot in the last couple of weeks, and this is not my area of expertise, but for this event, I've been reading a lot. And there is a very, very important element that both of you have referred to, and that is the value and the use of expert indigenous knowledge of people and communities living around those areas, and how, if so, in the formal machinery and processes of transition, there is any space for that kind of thing, whether it is how to mitigate public health, impact on public health, or waste management, and etc. Swati, thank you also for drawing attention to the question of the collieries here in England. I was referring to that, though I didn't quite say it as explicitly. And both you and I know, as you said, the continuing impact of the closure of the mines, and also how several of those regions continue to remain in an economic relationship of imbalance with other parts of England. So that's a very, very important thing. And in the context of India, that becomes so multiply, so simply because of the volume, because of the number of people involved. I mean, it's just the number of people we're talking about. But before we come to that discussion, may I invite Navroz Dubash, who is professor at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, and Navroz publishes on climate change, energy, air pollution, water policy, and the politics of regulation in the developing world. Navroz has written a couple of articles after CoP26. In fact, some of them we had circulated with our event notice. So a lot of people who've signed up to the event may have clicked on it and seen it. Navroz, please speak now.
Thank you very much, Nilanjan, for inviting me, and it's great to hear my fellow panelists, many of whom are old friends and fellow travelers, and I always learn from listening to them. Let me try and do a couple of things. I think you asked me to speak about policies, but before I do that, let me set the stage a little bit, or make sure I'm pulling out the strands of the conversation that we've just heard. So I think we've learned three things, all of which I agree with, and we've learned many more, but three that I want to emphasize. One is energy needs in India starting from a very low base, and they need to grow. There are some very nice charts, for example, showing a relationship between Human Development Index and energy and India, and basically the very straight correlation between those things. If India needs to provide basic human needs to its population, energy needs have to grow. They don't have to grow in a high carbon way. But the question is, how do we provide that energy in low carbon ways, and how fast can we pivot from the current coal-dominated energy system to a non-coal dominated system, right? That's the big question. But energy needs are substantial and energy will grow. The second is, as I think Shweta in particular said, and Swati emphasized, the environment and health costs are severe from the coal economy, even before we talk about climate change. And I think that's undisputed. There's good reason for India to try and move away from coal, quite aside from what we did or didn't say at Glasgow and changes of words here and there. And the third thing with that, I think Rahul said most clearly, is that coal is deeply enmeshed in the Indian political economy, in the fiscal system, in the livelihoods of communities, in important subsectors like railways, and something he didn't mention just probably because of time, also in the banking sector. We have a lot of Indian banks that are exposed heavily to the thermal power sector. So for all these reasons, in my view, what did or didn't happen at Glasgow will have marginal effects on what India does about coal. This is a domestic political economy conversation. And to my mind, actually, the targets, including in particular, a distant 2070 net zero target, is not really going to have an effect on what India does today. That's like basically saying, that a promise made in 1970 about 2020 energy scenarios would have made an effect. Let's think about where we were in 1970 and what the energy system was, what the world was looked like in 1970 compared to today, right? We were still on the gold standard. We hadn't even had an oil crisis. We didn't have the personal computer, and on and on. The more interesting question, and Vaibhav said this, is when we peak and at what level India will peak. That should be the conversation. We need to move the conversation up front, right? We need to be talking about the next decade, not just in India, but globally, is my belief. And that is going to be, and these big transformations are going to be driven by national political economies. Does that mean that what India or any country says globally doesn't matter? No. If India had, for example, made a pledge about renewable energy generation rather than capacity, it would have meant that we have to look at both capacity as well as renewable energy, as well as coal, and how the two interact. So if you talk about, so how you phrase your targets matters a great deal. And I, for one, would have really much rather we had a generation target rather than the coal capacity target that we did. So what is going to shift the coal story in India? And I'm going to make this one point and then pivot to the particular policies. Much more significant than the global pledges is the national economic case. And the case is shifting in the ways that Swati talked about, where the long-term prospects for coal are looking much less favorable than the long-term prospects for renewable energy. You can debate, and I'm sure Rahul will come back on some of these particular numbers as to whether renewable energy is more competitive and how you look at that and so on and so forth. But in the long run, the trend line is very clear that renewable energy is going to outcompete coal. So investing in new coal today is not a good bet, right? So this transition should take care of itself, except that there are three countervailing factors. One is there are relatively few players in the energy sector. It is increasingly an oligopolistic sector. And the government is showing signals of supporting both renewable energy and coal at the same time, right? And so there may be a lot of propping up of the coal economy for all kinds of complicated reasons, including for regional stability, for jobs, and so on and so forth. The second reason is that states like controlling their own power plants. So the way it works in India, you have centrally owned power plants, you have privately owned power plants, and you have state-owned power plants. States like having their own power plants. They like having the ability to call on those plants. It allows them to move things around in ways that are convenient to them. So there's reluctance to shut down plants, even if they're not terribly economic. And the third point is the enmeshing that Rahul talked about, and the fact that it will lead to a lot, that unwinding that knot that that integration of the fossil fuel economy with the political economy of India will take a lot of time. So what are the things that one could do? And I'll try and be quick here, Nilanjan. So one is to address the economics front and center. So India has talked about retiring old and dirty power plants on an accelerated basis for a while. It was even announced in a couple of budget speeches, but it hasn't really happened. And so thinking about transition mechanisms, the ADB has proposed such mechanisms where you can generate funds that are put to accelerate the phase down or the phasing out of old uneconomic power plants. And these funds could be, you could have money fed into them by everything from governments to the Green Climate Fund, to private banks, to philanthropies, to hasten, to basically buy down the retirement of old plants. And in fact, it would not be the worst use of climate money, of the Green Climate Fund and public climate money in the world to actually phase out the accelerated phase out of old coal-fired power plants in India. The second thing that could possibly happen is there's been reports that in the budget in India that will come out shortly, we have a coal cess, so a cess on coal, that will be waived for clean plants. So giving them a competitive advantage versus dirty plants. So there are all kinds of little financial levers. And the third and interesting piece is that with all coal-fired power plants, one of the most valuable things is actually the land they sit on. So how do you repurpose and redevelop that land to unlock its economic potential in ways that help sweeten that transition out of coal? So there are levers one can pull that accelerate the phase out of coal. The second thing is you have to think ahead to plug the gap that will develop in the fiscal situation of states that are coal dependent. So those states get a lot of their fiscal, their revenue from royalties and other coal related sources. And so they have no incentive to actually move away from the coal economy. It impacts negatively their fiscal situation. So that's something that the center will have to address. What is the alternative source? How do you plug that hole in the fiscal situation of what are some of the poorest states in India? The third is the package of just transition policies, right? What do we do about that? And I think the point is that we have to start, India should really start now. It's a decadal or more transformation. We have to think about this in deliberative ways that bring on board, obviously, those states, but also representatives of those communities, labor unions, and so on. India doesn't have a great tradition of doing this. South Africa, for example, by contrast, has, coming from the Mandela days, has a tradition of these sorts of deliberative processes. We could perhaps learn a little bit from that. The framing has to be a regional development framing. This isn't just about, this is about figuring out alternative regional economies that provide sustainable livelihoods for workers and the communities that service those workers and their families, right? It's not just the workers. Another aspect of the just transition is that most of these states, in kind of the resource curse language, tend to be states that haven't benefited from having the coal resource. They tend to be poorer states. They don't actually generate much demand. They actually have low levels of electrification in many cases, which is very ironic. And so there's very little incentive to invest in renewable energy in those states, both because the resource isn't there, as Rahul said, but also because demand isn't there. So there's scope for an interesting rethink of the whole model of the power sector in India in those states. How do you provide electricity in ways that enhances rural productivity, that makes those communities more willing to actually pay cost remunerative prices for electricity? So it's kind of a productive power model that we at CPR have been talking about, and time is brief, so I won't talk more about that. And finally, if we are to be able to compensate for the job losses from the coal economy with job creation in the renewable economy, it's not going to happen by itself. So India has to seriously think of an industrial policy strategy that allows us to compete and to be competitive in the various value chains that make up the renewable energy economy. And we've only just started thinking about that. And that's a big challenge. So in other words, this isn't just about coal phase out, it's actually about making renewable energy a serious job engine in India down the road. Okay, so that's what I want to say on the policy. Can I take another 1 minute, Nilanjan? I want to address this tension that many of us face as Indian participants in the climate debate. we all feel, let me not speak for others, I feel that there is a substantial hypocrisy of the North in the climate debate. And Nilanjan, I have to correct you on this. The statement about finance that you read out is a statement, and as you track climate change, there's a hierarchy of statements, as you well know, from the coulds to the shoulds to the wills to the maybes, and finance is definitely in the maybe category in that hierarchy of statements. So, we haven't seen the money mobilized. You have situations like the northern economies in a country like Norway, which is sitting on a sovereign wealth fund, inflated by gas, right? Lobbying the World Bank not to invest in gas projects in Africa, even though they have a pitiful per capita consumption of gas, right? And I think there's a proposition in terms of climate equity that one could make, which is that if we have scarce carbon, and we do, then that carbon should go to where it has the greatest welfare gains. And if everybody agrees to that proposition, I think we would actually see things changing a lot. We wouldn't be talking about coal versus gas versus oil quite in the way that we're doing. Rahul is quite right that the silence on gas and oil is unconscionable, and the emphasis on coal. So there is a hypocrisy in how we talk about this. At the same time, there's definitely a hypocrisy about how we talk about coal in India. For Indians and the poorest Indians, there would be a lot of benefits from not being so dependent on a coal economy. And it would be well worth trying to find a way to make that transition just for those who are dependent on the coal economy. So both these things are simultaneously true. I think we have to learn to hold both these things collectively in our head. And I think many of us, when we engage in global fora, are kind of caught, because you don't want criticism of the situation at home to, in a sense, provide cover for what we feel is hypocrisy in the North, and vice versa. So I think it would be really helpful if we could agree to hold these contradictions together and engage them as dual realities, and work with that as a premise going forward.
Thank you very much, Navroz. Could I just say that thank you very much for picking on what I read out. I read it out precisely to emphasize the fact that these statements continue to be made, and the background to this very statement is the fact, the established fact, acknowledged in the North with a capital N, that this has not been forthcoming despite the promise in the earlier COP. And unlikely, this situation will remain in Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27. So that's that. There is also, I'm probably not going to use the word hypocrisy here, and you'll know why, but I do think that there is something that is fundamentally wired into the manner in which the whole question of climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency, and you can see these words are an escalation of intensification. There is something that is very fundamentally about the manner in which the more developed countries of the world are addressing issues and seeking solutions that may be completely unworkable when you look at the globe as a whole and look at globalization and the entire phenomenon. I'll give you a very, very basic example. Someone living on the continent, or between England and the continent, could, if they were so conscious and willing, take a train to visit family in another country within the continent. I couldn't possibly take a train to India. That doesn't mean I'm in any way less concerned about these issues, but there are some very, very important ways in which we need to, as you say, Navroz, hold all the contradictions in balance, but also to acknowledge that this is not a situation of a one-size fits all, or a uniformity of application in how we may together and jointly seek to address, what we acknowledged at the very beginning is an issue, which is the question of global warming. But I think all of you have put me in my place by saying that the the whole change from phase out to phase down was nothing more than semantics, but also a point that Swati made very, very forcefully, but all of you have touched upon in different ways, is the whole question of just transition and how that can be achieved. Because at the core of all this is the whole question of who is actually going to be affected on the one hand as the transition happens, with all its problems and with all the pull and push factors that all of you have spoken about. But also, as Shweta pointed out, what are, and Navroz from how we can approach it, is that there are very, very dramatic and important immediate consequences of the continuing use of fossil fuels. So shall we go back to Rahul? Did you want to respond to any of the things that any of the others said, but particularly Navroz and Swati?
Thank you. I want to agree with Navroz's dichotomy point. It's spot on, but try and bring it together in a way about what do we do about it is the signals. And it really comes back to distortions. You have distortions on the West, Norway and other countries saying no gas in Africa, even though it's a trivial amount. And unfortunately, the distortions are going to get even worse when we start talking about offsets and instruments. So this nice to have, must have in that hierarchy, the more you peel the onion, the more hollowness you will find. And that's a big problem. And one of the mechanisms that's talked about for really handling it is land. And land is something that's even more scarce in the global South than it is in many other countries. So that's a very big global North-South issue. On the pricing signals, I mean, yes, we should clean up our coal or we should be paying that penalty. But the carbon cost, if you have a meaningful, quote unquote, carbon price, is far higher than the air pollution price from dirty coal, which if you meet the newest norms and more is actually lower. So I think the distortions, I'm going to just close with a rhetorical question. If something is cheap enough, why aren't we doing it anyways? So when everyone says, oh, renewables are cheaper, well, that's why they're getting built, but they're not getting built for the evening because they're not cheaper yet with a battery. Yet, again, the trends, as Navroz says, are correct, but distortions, just as one example, the government has a plan, the center will give a subsidy of 40% to any household putting up a rooftop solar. So the problem I have with these support mechanisms is you are subsidizing the rich. And figuring out these sorts of distortions is there on rooftop solar, it's there on electric vehicles with public charging infrastructure. It's about redistribution. Now, the problem is we have messes in our discoms. This transition doesn't make their life any easier. So maybe we have to solve it as a conjoint problem.
I'm going to come to Shweta also to ask her about the question of indigenous knowledge. But before that, Swati, did you briefly want to respond to any of the things that Navroz said?
So I think the only thing I would stress would be there are many, many cases, and this is particularly true in climate policy, that things happen which should be cheaper and they don't happen simply because there are political interests or other economic interests which are in the stranded asset which you want to phase out. So I don't quite take the point that Rahul is making that this is really to do with that there aren't cheaper alternatives. Cheaper alternatives also come when there has been enough investment and research on them. So in that sense, that's one thing that, we are at LSE, I have to bring in Nick Stern's view on this, which is to say that one of the things that he's always sort of really emphasized, and particularly to shame us economists who don't think of this far, enough. So in that sense, I'm glad Rahul's pointed that out, is that many investments are not undertaken because we don't quite have the institutions that exist to internalize those long-term benefits. And in that sense, if the investment isn't happening now, that's not to say that it isn't viable necessarily. It's that it isn't viable in the current circumstances because of other interests that operate as well. So I think I wouldn't want to stop at just saying that there are these distortions, and that's why we see that cheaper alternatives aren't coming into place. Yes, those distortions exist, and we need to basically weed them out.
Nilanjan, can I just respond for 30 seconds?
Yes, please do, very briefly.
I agree with Swati's point that there are things that stop us from doing what should be viable today. But the one difference is we are talking today about marginal changes. Economists talk about equilibrium. The future we're grappling with is not going to be an equilibrium. So there are step function changes. And for example, in your electricity grid, adding a little bit of RE is very different than being 80%, 90%, 100% RE. It's very non-linear. The good news is you don't have to worry about that tail. India and many countries can first worry about the earliest 50%, 80%. So let's focus on that.
Okay, Swati, we are going to come back to you, but Shweta.
I had actually 2 or 3 points to make. I think one point that Nilanjan, you mentioned about the escalation of language, climate crisis to climate emergency. I think I want that escalation to happen because in Global South, we are living it. It's not in the future. Climate emergency is now. I mean, in the last 1 year, the kind of extreme weather events that we have experienced in India alone, and not a single state in the country has been untouched by it. I mean, every state has experienced the loss of property, the loss of lives that have happened. This is our reality, and this should be highlighted, and for the right reasons, and not for the fear of future. It's this for Global South, it's now. So that's one point I want to make. The other point that we're talking about, and in the context of just transition that we're talking about, and invariably sort of steer the conversation towards that, I think we have to see the problem of coal from a social perspective, and it's not just like a technical problem or a planning problem, but from a social lens, we need to analyze this problem that coal has brought to our communities. And coal has actually divided the historical injustices and actually benefited from the injustices and profited from that. So, and that's one of the reasons why you see that the most marginalized areas which have the coal plants and the coal mines continue to be marginalized, because coal benefits from that. So when we are rethinking and when we are thinking a phase out from coal, we are not just thinking of replacing one form of energy with another. That's just energy transition. When we're talking about just transition, and to justify the word just, which means justice, I think we need to involve the local communities. We need to involve the indigenous communities. We need to involve women. We need to involve young people, and then sort of chart out the aspiration. And one thing we need to be aware of the fact that because of the coal presence and coal extraction and coal use, there are very, very limited and finite ecological resources, more finite than anywhere else. So the choices that people have are already limited. Right from the access to water or access to land, or in a lot of places, the habitat loss because of forests. So I think we need to be mindful of that. But the principle from just interacting with communities, I think the acknowledgement of the injustices, addressing them and undoing them would be key in when we're talking about just transition.
Thank you very much for saying it so eloquently, Shweta. I was trying very hard not to quite say it in the way that I'm going to say it now, but I think what is crucial in all this is not only identifying, you see, justice related to justice, and it's not only a question of identifying where the justice/injustice is, but also where we locate the act of justice in the transition, and how we then enable the dynamism. Swati, I'm going to give you a second to come back to what Rahul said, because I think you wanted to say something, and then Vaibhav, I'll come to you.
No, I take Rahul's point that this is not about marginal investments. Of course it isn't. This is about a really serious change in industrial policy and how that's to be done in the future, and which is why it becomes really critical to involve people and think of what the employment and livelihood impacts will be. And if we can afford to spend so much on these production-linked incentive schemes and so on and so forth as part of our industrial policy, this is just one of those elements which also needs to be taken into account.
Vaibhav.
Yeah, thank you, Nilanjan. So on the question of finance and why does it keep circulating in the global north and doesn't come to the south? I think what happened in the US last month was very interesting, and we know that the Build Back Better bill, it couldn't go through because of the federal deficit it would have caused, right? So the agreement was up to a $1.5 trillion of additional federal deficit across 10 years. And the bill was coming out to be around $3 trillion. And that's where the talks broke down. right? So it was very interesting that it wasn't really the what we keep on reading in many surveys, that Republicans are against the climate issue as a whole and all that. It wasn't like that at all. In fact, the Republicans were very much for that. It is just that the economic cost when in the larger geopolitics, every penny matters. When as a US economy, you're trying to compete with China and outcompete them, right? In this larger system of things, when these kind of economic costs and perceived economic costs are supposed to be so high, then it starts really mattering. And or definitely when the bill fell through, of course it has impact, implications for the availability of finance that flows to the south. And this story is not, it's of course it's about the US. Very similar stories across many parts of the world, and that's why acknowledging this sort of reality is also very important, because we have to acknowledge that ultimately this whole question of political economy is not just a developing country question. It's in a very different way. It's also, the political economy is also prevalent in the most developed countries, are very high income countries of the world. And this, what happened last month, is a very clear manifestation of that. And I think this sort of this dichotomy will probably continue unless we are able to find some smart solution to it, which is very market based solution. Otherwise it'll never probably going to happen.
Okay, we don't have much time, so I'm going to pose the last question, which is to all of you, because all of you have referred to the whole question of political economy and how deeply ingrained it is. And therefore, all the other things that one is talking about also stems from this. But at the heart of this, and Navroz brought this out very starkly by giving the 1970-2020, 50 years backwards example, is at the heart of this is whether we're looking at it in terms of the next 25 years or the next 50 years or whatever, there is a question of the political in this, as in the politics, and I think the audience, as well as I myself, would be very keen to hear from all of you as experts who are dealing with this from within the perspective of political economy and are seeing the problems and issues in it, both immediate, long-term, short-term, medium-term, is, given that this is a long-term issue and needs to be handled on the long term, at the same time, as Navroz mentioned, if you take power plants, there are centrally owned ones and there are state-owned ones, and they will continue even if they are loss-making, etc., because of various other interests that are involved. The question is, how does one come up with some sort of understanding, I'm not using the word consensus, about a climate action plan that will, in its essence and its core, be continued over the forthcoming decades, irrespective of who is in political power at which level, whether center or state? Or is that not possible? And therefore, this is something that will in fact have further hiccups that are in fact unrelated to the sector but to external factors. Does anyone want to start? Rahul?
I think the political economy lens, let's leave aside the minors or the distribution of the political economy and just talk national and state level politics. The single biggest driver for a lot of tech and change, because these are transformations we're talking about, is jobs. And I think any solution that says I'm going to create jobs is going to be accepted and even subsidized. I mean, you literally have subsidies if someone wants to set up a factory over a certain size. And so that is probably going to be the biggest driver. And the sad thing and the good thing is it doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen, and we have time to make some of this in India. So the very short run will look very different than the medium run, but both of these are aligned with these larger targets, whether they're on storage, EVs, etc. Because otherwise, of course, if you just go by pure economics, you're going to be better off importing cheap material from certain countries, no names required. And so I think that dynamic, that as long as the losers are either compensated or kept steady. So the bigger challenge is the equilibrium was based on growth. So the first step will be that we need to find an equilibrium based on a plateau. Once you are able to do that, then the new tech, clean tech, and all the other stuff is pure icing, pure growth of jobs, pure growth of, economic growth. So I think you'll find support for it regardless of who's in power.
Great. Navroz?
Yes, thank you. So I think the way we've been doing climate politics for quite a long time has actually been to try and think of it as a global diplomatic problem. And that, in a sense, has not taken seriously the fact that we have differing national politics.
Sorry, did you say a global diplomatic problem? Is that what?
That's right. It's basically the climate negotiations have been around trying to have diplomats essentially negotiate a division of spoils, a carbon budget that gets carved up, and then we all go home and figure out. We do some analysis at home, we show up, we say, this is what we can do, we try and negotiate, and then we go home and implement it. And the Paris moment was a switch where they said, okay, that's not really feasible. Let's have everybody figure out what they want to put on the table, go back and try and do it, hopefully create a virtuous cycle where we find it's less costly and more attractive to do these things, and win support and come back with an enhanced pledge in a few years, right? That was the shift in thinking. Unfortunately, what we see is that bet that let's try and have progressive national politics emerge in country after country has swung back in Glasgow to saying, no, actually, we're not sure that'll work. We're not sure it'll be fast enough. We're not sure it'll get us to 1.5. Actually, what we really want is everybody to give us a statement at the global level that they're going to do what it takes. And because countries are not able to make that statement because the politics doesn't support it, what's the solution? You square that circle by giving a pledge off into the distant future that politicians today are not going to be held accountable to. So 2050 pledges, 2070 pledges is the solution to that problem. And I think that where we've made a mistake is actually not taking seriously the fact that what we need to do is shift domestic politics, and that will be different in different countries. So in Scandinavia, in parts of Europe, the story about existential threat and net zero emissions and so on works. You have popular support behind it. You have young people mobilizing around it. I don't think it works in the US. I don't think it works in India. I think in India, it is much more going to be a job story. In South Africa, it's going to be a jobs and just transition story in important sectors like the coal sector. In China, it's going to be an economic competitiveness story and an export of technology story and so on. So we have to have some freedom to develop national narratives that work with our national politics and drive those forward. Where India and many other countries are failing is we're not being creative enough about creating those national politics. And where the UK has done extremely well, I think, is building bodies like the Climate Change Committee that do analysis that is put in the public domain, that forms kind of a seed around which progressive politics forms. We don't have an analogous body. I think a commission-like structure embedded in a transparent framework would be really useful in countries like India. So, but the global situation, the more we try and presume that a single narrative, net zero, is going to actually lead to progressive politics in other countries, I think it'll actually be a misstep.
Yes, thank you very much. That sounds quite along the lines of what many others think as well. I think one of the things that has happened, I've thought about this in a completely different context, Navroz, is I'm speaking about the United Kingdom and about England in particular, because this is where I live, is that during the pandemic, we'd have these regular press conferences where ministers would come up or the prime minister would come up, but you'd also have the chief scientific officer and you'd have the chief medical officer. And through the course of, because we were all locked up at home, it occurred to me on several occasions that, this format of getting experts to talk about expert knowledge in accessible ways for the public at large to hear, and therefore, in a sense, force the public to engage with deciphering that knowledge, is a very effective way than it either coming in the form of a top-down policy or through politicians. and because it gives the public the immediate impression that these are experts with no particularly expressed vested interests except the interest of their own knowledge and expertise, which leads to a certain kind of what you referred to as progressive politics, but to a certain kind of awareness, which then leads to politics, however we may want to define the word politics. I know Vaibhav wants to say something, but before that, I was going to ask Shweta if you wanted to say anything just by way of closing remarks, and Vaibhav, I'll come to you.
Yes, thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned the pandemic, because I think, in terms of future policy or future realities that we are living in, I think the biggest lesson that we can learn is from the pandemic itself, not just in terms, it has actually, COVID-19 has told us what's wrong and has given us, with our policies, with our economic or social models, and we cannot, work against what is there in the natural world and against nature and against people's health, and anything that would affect our environmental and public health is going to cost us a lot of time, money, energy, and push us back many years. So I think it's important to learn these lessons from COVID pandemic, which unfortunately most nations are not learning. And if you see the policies that have come post-pandemic, the revival of economy policies is completely going to make us a train wreck. But in terms of the principles that need to be there in policy making, I think, Nilanjan, you did talk about, it's important to talk about science, but I think more important is science that is demystified and publicly accessible, that what you mentioned about transparency, decentralized nature of decision making itself, and something that is locally owned. Because I think the more and more that we are understanding the climate mess, the more we realize that these are locally owned solutions that will actually protect communities and rebuild communities. So it's important that it's transparent, decentralized, locally owned, and demystified.
Vaibhav?
Yeah, thank you, Nilanjan. First of all, let me say I completely agree with what Rahul and Navroz said about India being a job story and also economic growth. Those are the two very important drivers for the political economy in India. Very important. On the other thing, let me place these two alternative views on the table and let the participants and experts and colleagues in this discussion decide for themselves. Right. So the first opinion is that, well, in terms of going ahead and thinking about decarbonization or any other developmental approach, let's think about the next 10 years, or the near term rather, right? And then the other is, let's think about the longer term, some sort of longer term vision, and then think about intermediate steps to reach that vision, right? So these are very alternative approaches. What India has been doing, I think, for a large part of the last 50 years has been the former, right? And exactly that's what the 5-year plans are about, right? And in fact, many of my colleagues, including me, are very strongly believe that the mess that you see in India, in many places, look at the urbanization, right? Look at the way it is grown. This mess is only because we've only thought about 5-year plans. We've actually never, generally speaking, so there would be reports about 30 years long, but none of the politicians have taken those reports seriously. They're just there. In reality, it is always about, these are the near-term opportunities, let me grab it. So this is 5-year plan system of India, and this is what it has achieved. So I think I would just disagree a bit with Navroz here in terms of the example of 1970 and 2020. I think it's fairly simplistic, right? We never had a target in 1970 for a 2020 India. If we had a target, maybe the reality could have been very different, right? So the question is always about this policy signals and the power of policy signals, long-term policy signals. And that is these two alternative opinions. I know Navroz is shaking his head, and that's exactly what I'm saying. These are two alternative opinions. One opinion is long-term visions and targets do matter a lot. The other is that, well, no, near-term thinking and near-term actions is what really matters a lot. Well, I side with the other one, where long-term targets are extremely important, these visions, and they give us this pathway towards achieving a future, which otherwise we would actually never achieve, because we will be only dealing with 5-year and 10-year plans, right? So let me leave it out there. And as I said, these two opinions are there. Let all the panelists and the experts and the colleagues in the participants here, choose for themselves that which one they do align with. Thank you, Nilanjan.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give Swati the last word, but before that, this may well be a lack of understanding on my part, but I didn't really think that Navroz was saying that there was a 50-year plan starting 1970, but what he was saying was that from 1970 to 2020, there have been so many changes, and then therefore, logically, 2020 to 2070. But Navroz, did you want to come back very briefly to say anything? Or are you agreed to end this on having parallel paths of opinion?
It's clearly not going to be resolved, so maybe I'll see what I can in 15 seconds. For future plans to drive the present, you would need to have institutions that translate the future into the present. You would need to have politics that valorizes the future over the short term, and you would need to have a reasonable sense of the determinacy of the pathways. And when you look at modeling studies in a 10-year or 20-year horizon, there is 100% difference in projected emissions. There are so many possible pathways that backcasting from a particular future to the present is just, especially for a country like India that is changing dramatically, is extremely hard. So 3 conditions have to be met, and at the moment, I don't think any of them are met. So it's theoretically possible. In practice, I don't think it's likely.
Okay, well, that's great, because if we have 2 divergent or parallel views working together, there is hope that at least one solution will come out of them. Swati, you have the last word before I say goodbye.
Perfect. Instead of raking up more issues that we'll disagree on, let me end with the one issue that I think we all pretty much agreed on, which is the importance of the jobs narrative when it comes to clean policies in India. And in particular, I think COVID has actually, we're coming out of what is sort of the biggest shock to working lives everywhere in the world, and particularly in India. And if we're going to get out of that looking like we're people with sound health and sound jobs, grasping this opportunity of being able to tap into whatever climate funds are available and being able to plan that transition early on is really going to be critical in terms of what are the job prospects as well as the environmental and health impacts that happen in the future. So I want to sort of end at that very reconciliatory thing. I think that's one thing that we can all agree on that is really, really fundamentally important here.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that was something that we had very obviously, irrespective of not only the perspectives from which we were all coming to this subject, but also the politics from which we may be coming to this subject. I think we cannot possibly lose sight of how to ensure that the impact of any kind of transition for the better of the world does not lose sight of the least privileged in the short term, the middle term, or the long term. I want to thank all our panelists. I want to thank our audience, and this is a perfect time to tell the audience that in fact, it was in the course of this event that I realized that the 6 of us are from 5 places, and this virtual event allows us to do so. So Vaibhav Chaturvedi in Delhi, and Navroz Dubash in Singapore, Shweta Narayan in Kerala, and Rahul Tongia in Bangalore, and from Swati Dhingra, and from me, Nalanjan